Welcome to Sparks of History, where Jewish history and world history meet. We are very honored and pleased to have with us today Rabbi Daniel Feldman. Rabbi Feldman is a Rosh Yeshiva at the Rabbi Elchanan Theological Seminary, RIETS, at Yeshiva University, as well as an instructor in the Syms School of Business. Rabbi Feldman received his ordination, smicha, from RIETS, where he was a fellow of the Bella and Harry Wexner Kollel Elyon, and serves as the executive editor of the RIETS initiative of Yeshiva University Press. Rabbi Feldman is the author of a number of books, including The Right and the Good, Halakhah and Human Relations, Divine Footsteps, Chesed and the Jewish Soul, False Facts and True Rumors, Lashon Hara in Contemporary Culture, as well as 5 volumes of Talmudic essays entitled Binah BaSefarim. Rabbi Feldman is the co-editor of more than 10 volumes of Talmudic essays in Jewish thought and serves on the editorial board of Tradition magazine. Rabbi Feldman is currently the spiritual leader of Or Sadia in Teaneck, New Jersey. And today we will be discussing Rabbi Feldman's fascinating and very important work, Letter and Spirit, Evasion, Avoidance, and Workarounds in the Halakhic system. Thank you, Rabbi Feldman, for being with us. We appreciate it very much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Just to begin, briefly, what is the main thesis of Letter and Spirit, and what are some examples of the workarounds? I know there's also evasions and avoidances, but I guess we'll use the word workarounds today in Jewish law presented in Letter and Spirit.
Well, terminology is very much the issue because it's hard to find the right word, and that's a big part of the challenge. So with the terminology, we're at best addressing the perception of the subject rather than the subject itself. And a big part of the book is trying to actually address the substance. But the subject is that we should try to have an appreciation for these devices and to recognize where they come from and challenge the attitude of cynicism that sometimes surrounds many of these approaches and that sometimes affects the system itself and the perception that, oh, we can get around anything and the rabbis could do whatever they want if they're motivated enough, and that nothing really matters and nothing really is binding, and try to display how these approaches have developed within the context of the system, why some of them are much more accepted, some are much more controversial, some are somewhere in the middle, some depend very much on the details, and to try to bring out an appreciation for that and to combat that attitude of cynicism, which can do so much harm to religious sincerity and to everything that's important to us.
So what are examples, and what are we talking about when we talk about whether it's a workaround or whatever other word we want to use for this?
Right.
What is this?
Well, one of the most well-known probably is Mechiras Chametz, selling Chametz before Pesach and then reuniting with it after Pesach. There's also the selling of land in Israel before the Shemitah year, which is far more controversial. There's also the Prusbul, which dates back to the Mishnah, which is a way of not having loans canceled by the end of the Shemitah year. There's the Heter Iska, which allows one to provide funds for business purposes and to take profits from those funds, even though interest on loans is prohibited by the Torah. There's the Shtar Chatzi Zachar, which allows one to distribute assets and death as one desires, despite the fact that the Torah has very limited commandment as far as inheritance is concerned. Approaches such as that.
So before we go into some of these examples, if I understand correctly, you have attempted to lay out 4 criteria when evaluating these workarounds. What are the 4 criteria, and how do you balance these 4 criteria?
So the first is the letter of the law, because if it doesn't satisfy the requirements of halacha, it's really going to be a non-starter, although sometimes that itself is at issue. So assessing just how compliant it is with the requirements of halacha is the first question. And that's really itself a two-part question, because sometimes it's a question of whether it accomplishes what it needs to accomplish in order to address whatever the halachic challenge is. And sometimes the issue is maybe it does do that, but it may not be permissible to do, or it may be controversial as far as its permissibility. So, for example, to talk about the Het Mechira, which has stirred up so much controversy. So both of those parts are a matter of great debate. So does it actually work that if one sells land in Israel, that will remove it from the obligations of Shemitah? And then there was a whole separate controversy, maybe even a greater controversy, that even if we acknowledge that that does work, maybe there's a prohibition to do that. Maybe one's simply not allowed to sell land in Israel. Maybe that's a greater problem. So that's a two-part question, which is all our first criterion there. Is the letter of the law satisfied? And if not, we won't get past that, because that's the first question. How exactly do we comply with and address the demands of halacha in of itself? But then the second and also the third questions relate to the spirit of the law, because we understand that it's important to not only comply with the letter of halacha, but that we assume there's also an intent of the Torah, and that that's also important. And very often that's where the problem is, or that's where we suspect the problem is, because sometimes there's a feeling that maybe we are complying with the letter of halacha, but that we've really found a way to get around what the intent of the Torah actually is. And if that were indeed to be the case, so then we should feel uncomfortable about that. We know that we do have a value of trying to fulfill as much as we can perceive what it is, the intent of the Torah. The Ramban writes in a number of places in Chumash, Kedoshim Tiyu, that tells us that we have to understand the spirit of Kedusha of the Torah, Vasisa Hayashra Vahatov. We have to understand the spirit of Yashrus and Tov that dictates our interpersonal relationships. And if we don't have that mentality coming through, so even if we are satisfying the letter of the halacha, there's something tremendous that's missing. So we don't want to be doing that. And that's often where the problem is, the feeling that maybe, okay, so whatever we're doing has satisfied the letter of halacha, but it's a way of getting around what it's really about. So that second question will be, is that indeed the case? And to what of in the case of Mechiras Chametz, or the Het Mechira, so the claim is something's being sold, that Chametz is being sold, the land is being sold. So the question is that actually happening, or is that what you might call a sham transaction? It's not really happening. So in the case of the Heter Iska, so the claim is that it's not a loan anymore, it's being converted into a investment. So is that actually happening? So questions like that become important questions. There's a joke that they say that the rabbis are going to come out and prohibit smoking, but the Orthodox Jews aren't worried because they'll sell their lungs to a non-Jew. So for the record, that doesn't work. The question is, why not?
It's good to know. It's good to know it doesn't work.
It's good to know. If for the record it doesn't work, don't try that at home. But the issue is representative of both of these last 2 points, because in terms of the spirit of the halacha, if the issue is that smoking is unhealthy, it's not going to be any healthier if you sell your lungs to a non-Jew. You're still going to take on the danger just as much. But also in terms of this last point, the claim that you're selling your lungs to a non-Jew, what would the words mean? You're still going to walk around with your lungs inside of you for the rest of your life. You're still going to be breathing through those lungs. So the claim that they're being sold is essentially a meaningless claim. So that's also a part of the assessment here. Two parts of it. One is, does it actually address the spirit of the law in any meaningful way? And the next question is, are you actually doing what you're claiming to do, or is it a sham of a process? And that's also sometimes a source of great controversy. And then the fourth factor, which impacts and is impacted by all of the first three questions, because especially given that it's hard to score 100% on all three of the first questions, is the issue of need. So how necessary is this? Presumably, if there isn't some degree of need, why get involved in changing anything? So presumably there's some need, and the greater the need, the more we can tolerate a less than perfect answer in the first three areas. So that's a question you asked about balance, so they all can rise or fall in relation to each other. And the issue of need can be different types. Sometimes it's a halachic need. So for example, Gemara already in the Rishonim talked about selling an animal that was about to have a bechor, because the issue of the kedusha of a bechor nowadays is a great halachic challenge because there isn't really any good way to address that. So that's a halachic need, and that is one type of need. Sometimes it's economic need, sometimes it's a spiritual need, sometimes it's somewhere in between. But the question of just how pressing the need is going to itself be a major factor. And that interplays with those first three questions, and the greater need can make it more tolerable to have a weaker answer in those first three areas. And a stronger answer in the first three areas can make it okay to not necessarily have such a great need or urgency.
If we can perhaps take a deeper dive into the Heter Iska, what exactly is the Heter Iska? How did it develop and become accepted? And how did economic changes over the centuries impact on the Heter Iska?
Okay, the Heter Iska, very briefly, because it's a very complicated topic, but essentially it's a device that has been in use in its current form, although it's taken already a couple of different forms, but in its different forms over the past few centuries, really since about the 1500s, was popularly associated with the Talmud Chacham known as the Maharam of Vigdors, Rabbi Nachum Mendel of Vigdors, and it's based on a concept that goes back to the Gemara, was Daf Yomi just a few weeks ago, and the logic to it is that instead of a loan that collects interest, it's basically an investment in a business venture, and the money that comes to the provider of funds is coming as a profit participation. So the idea there is, therefore, that it shouldn't really be or shouldn't at all be a violation of the Torah's prohibition of ribis in the letter of the law, because it's not a loan, rather it's an investment. But as far as the spirit of the law, I believe that the issue is that it can be displayed that the intent of the Torah with the prohibition of ribis, which is a very serious prohibition in the Torah, comes up 3 times, and it's one that is very significantly enhanced by rabbinic law, but that the emphasis there seems to be on the mitzvah of halva and the mitzvah of chesed that's represented by lending money, and that chesed should be protected. A lot of different ways to understand exactly how it does that, but they all seem to revolve around that. So that when the loan is for somebody who can't pay their bills, who has expenses, has whatever issues that they can't cover, so then we're supposed to help them out, and to charge interest in that context is against the letter and the spirit of halacha. But when it's for a business venture, so then it is perhaps strongly possible to argue that it's not a contradiction of the spirit of halacha, it's just a question then of the letter of halacha. And if we can successfully convert it to an investment rather than a loan, that would accomplish both. And the question of economic changes seems to also be a very major factor, because indeed there was a major shift towards the capitalist economy. And for example, among others, the Torah Temimah discusses this in his commentary to Chumash, where he notes that once upon a time, if somebody borrowed money, likely there were 2 things that were true. The person borrowing the money was in dire financial straits, and the person lending the money wasn't undertaking any opportunity cost by parting with that money for some period of time. But now, those 2 things are not necessarily true. It could be that the person borrowing money may simply have a business opportunity he wants to pursue, and the person who is parting with the money is taking on an opportunity cost by separating from that money for that period of time. So that is a significant change in the nature of the economy that is significant, and it also affects the factor of need. So the reality that to participate in the contemporary economy is going to require some type of possibility of investment in capital became a very significant factor. So, for example, more recently, the Chuvas Chelkas Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Reich of Switzerland, has a whole introduction to his Chuvas about Heter Iska, where he states very strongly that the entire economic survival of the Jewish people is dependent on finding a way to allow this, and this should be considered a crisis of great magnitude that really requires pursuing an approach along these lines. So all those factors do come together. It really addresses all the 4 of our factors that we mentioned before, that we address the letter of the law in terms of how it's converted to a investment rather than a loan, the spirit of the law in the sense that it should only be used towards business investments rather than chesed loans, And then the question of the third issue is to make sure that it is indeed an investment and structured that way. But the aspect of need is one that was highlighted strongly by those poskim who felt that functioning in the contemporary economy would essentially be impossible without working out some type of approach to allow this.
Was there a process in which the Heter Iska became more accepted? In other words, when it initially was formulated, was there opposition? And then as the situation changed economically, it became more accepted? Or is there still controversy surrounding the Heter Iska?
So there definitely was a process, because today I would say there's very little controversy about the existence of the Heter Iska. There is some controversy as to what situations are appropriate for a Heter Iska. There were some poskim, Moshe Feinstein among them, who were very strict about what you could use it for, and stressed that to use it for anything other than a business, a profit-generating kind of context, not only would violate the spirit of the halacha, but as Rabbi pointed out, would violate the letter of halacha also, would probably really just be straight ribbis dressed up as something else, because the whole theory and logic to it has to do with the assumption that there's at least the potential of profit coming from what's going on. So as far as what it applies to, there was some history of controversy. Even recently, there were those who were much more liberal in terms of what it could be used for, understanding that money was fungible and that even loans for things that were not necessarily profit generating could also be included within a Heter Iska, and others who were much more machmir about that. But the existence of the Heter Iska, at least for some things, today seems to be very widely accepted. But at the outset, there was greater controversy about it. And there is some history in the literature, those saying it should only be used for rabbinically prohibited ribbis. That seems to have changed over the course of the year, over the course of the centuries. Schechter often tells the story about somebody who passed away, a wealthy businessman who passed away, and later on somebody had a dream that this businessman came to him in a dream and looked like he was in terrible shape. And the individual who was having the dream asked him, "Why you look so terrible?" And he said, "I'm having a very bad time in the next world. They got me on ribbis." And the individual asked him, "But didn't you always use a Heter Iska?" And the response was, "That works down here, it doesn't work upstairs." So there was a history of controversy at first, but I would say today it's widely accepted, at least for certain usages. But the question of when and how is it applicable, there is still some history of controversy as far as that's concerned.
What exactly is the prosbul? How does it work? Did it go through similar processes like the Heter Iska in terms of the economic situation? And what are the arguments to combat cynicism regarding the enactment of a prosbul?
So that's a great question, because the prosbul is one of the most misunderstood concepts in halacha, because the prosbul has, in a sense, compared to all of the topics that we talk about, perhaps the most esteemed pedigree, because it really goes back to the Mishnah, and it was an institution of Hillel. So it has a very strong pedigree and a very strong history and acceptance ever since then, even though there's some debate about it in the Gemara itself, the Gemara in Masechtas Gittin, where the sugi appears. But the Mishnah in Shvius, it's already something that has appeared since then. So nowadays, there's no controversy about the existence of the prosbul, but there is a lot of misunderstanding that surrounds it, and that contributes to a lot of the cynicism that sometimes surrounds this whole subject. So it's very important to try to appreciate what it is and what it isn't. In terms of the actual halachic mechanism, that there's a lot to figure out. There's a lot of different opinions, but somehow what it accomplishes is that it prevents the cancellation of loans at the end of the Shemitah year. So the Torah declares that Shemitah should bring about the cancellation of loans. We understand that means the end of the Shemitah year, somewhat of a discussion. We understand it means the end of the Shemitah year. And when one utilizes a prosbul, so then those loans aren't canceled. How exactly that works is a major discussion in the Rishonim, whether that was making use of a previously existing concept, whether that was a completely new concept. There are many different theories as to how exactly it works, but somehow the utilization of this document, of this prosbul, that can be very easily filled out, and something that we still do today every Shemitah year at the end, so that prevents the cancellation of loans.
So if I take a loan or if I give a loan, before the Shemitah year, the seventh year, have to sign a prosbul.
The one who gives the loan, the
One
one
who
who's
gives the
holding the
loan
loan.
has to sign the prosbul. Okay.
Right.
And
And
this
then
is
he's able.
even if we're dealing on that loan with the heter iska?
Yeah, it's unrelated to the heter iska because the heter iska has to do with collecting interest or what would otherwise be interest, and this is about collecting the loan at all after Shemitah year. There's some interesting comparisons to be drawn between the two, and that's a much longer discussion. We do talk about it a little bit in the book, but they're different concepts. There is some overlap. There may be an overlapping theory between the two, but they are different ideas completely. So here, the prosbul is very often utilized and misunderstood, I think, to create the impression that the rabbis can essentially do whatever they want if they're motivated enough. And in this case, they are motivated to help their rich friends collect their loans and not lose out. And therefore, they created this document in order to allow them to do that. And I think arguably every part of that sentence is not accurate. So crucially, as the Gemara already points out, we're probably assuming that Shemitah nowadays is not a Torah obligation, and that's a major part of the functionality of prosbul, the way the Gemara probably presents it. It's a little bit of a complicated sugya, but that seems to be the way it emerges. So we're first of all assuming that the obligations here are rabbinic in nature, and that plays a very major part in how that plays out. Secondly, it's not about helping the rich people collect on their loans. It's really about helping the poor people get loans in the first place, which is a crucial priority we find throughout the Gemara. The Gemara says in every other page, we don't want the poor to have the doors slammed in their face. They shouldn't be able to receive loans in the first place. So this was enacted in order to make sure that's there. To whatever extent it's to help the rich, but you find some language like that, it's to help them spiritually, to protect their souls, because the Torah has very harsh language about somebody who would hold back from lending because of the fear that the loan would be canceled. So if we're helping the rich, it's about helping them spiritually, protecting their souls, that they shouldn't be condemned for refusing to lend in the first place. So that's really the goal, to make sure that these loans take place, that they happen. And that was clearly the motivation. And it's also understood if we perceive here that the main goal is the mitzvah of Hava, similar to what we find in the context of Ribbis also, and that's where there may really be a commonality between them, that it's about making sure that this mitzvah of Chesed that is represented powerfully by the obligation of providing loans to the needy, that should be there and that should prevail. And the Torah has a whole cluster of mitzvos that support that mitzvah in a secondary way. So we should provide the loans, that's the biggest priority. And to support that, we should also not take interest, and we shouldn't pressure the borrower, and we should cancel the loans after the Shemitah year. Those are all secondary mitzvos that are there to support the mitzvah primarily of providing a loan in the first place. But if any of those secondary mitzvos are going to undermine the primary mitzvah, they're going to result in the not being the loan. So then that's going to be counterproductive, especially if the mitzvah we're talking about is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, is a rabbinic mitzvah that is there to help commemorate the whole concept. So then the rabbis presumably perceived that that would be greatly counterproductive. So to make sure that a rabbinic mitzvah to remember the idea of Shemitah shouldn't lead to the result that the poor aren't getting loans in the first place, and they worked it out that there should be a different way of remembering the concept of Shemitah, and that the prosbul would accomplish that, and that we would also make sure that the poor would get the loans that they needed, and that the rich shouldn't be in violation of what the Torah calls blial, a very harsh condemnation of those who would hold back from this crucial chesed. And that is much more what's going on in this system of prosbul.
And the cynicism regarding the prosbul stems from what? Is it that people are looking at it and saying this rabbinical enactment is just totally circumvents the law, or is it more that how does it work? The rabbis have take this loan and turn it into something else, or the money is not really a loan anymore? Like, how does it work? And is that part of the criticism or the cynicism towards it?
Well, how it works is a hard question to answer because that's not expressly explained in the Gemara, and the Rishonim have to figure it out. There are a couple of different theories. Perhaps the most common theory that you find in the Rishonim is that the Mishnah already said that there is an idea that if one turns over his loan documents to the Bezdin and makes the Bezdin the agent of collection, that Shemitah wouldn't cancel that. So Prusbul may have been a utilization of that. It's a question why the Mishnah mentions them both separately. That's something the Rishonim ask. So it may be that Hillel just advocated utilizing a tool that was already there, or did he actually create something new? That's itself a discussion. So there's a lot that revolves around that. Maybe it utilizes other principles in Halakhah. That's actually a very extensive discussion, how exactly it works, but that's probably the most common theory. But perhaps also the idea here is that there are actually easier ways for it to be accomplished, that goal, but that would have completely canceled out the whole idea of Shemitah. So there's that irony here, actually, that Rav Herzog was the first chief rabbi after the state started. So Rav Herzog, in his writings, wrote that even though there could have been easier ways to accomplish the same goal, the rabbis instituted Prusbul specifically to counter the perception that you could just take care of whatever you want without any kind of a process. And therefore, Prusbul was supposed to make that point, and ironically, it ended up being perceived the opposite way. So he understood that there could have been other ways, that there are many of the Rishonim pointed this out, that there could have been other ways to accomplish this goal, but that Prusbul was the proactive way in order to preserve the memory of Shvius, of Shemitah, and to accomplish those goals in a way that showed that it wasn't something that could be just dismissed with a wave of a hand, but had to go through a certain process, so that one shouldn't have that cynical perception. And ironically, somehow it became the opposite in the perception of many.
Can the concept of workarounds apply to what rabbinic leadership has attempted to do regarding aguna-related issues or prenuptial agreements? Is that part of the letter and the spirit and workarounds? Can we apply that to those two areas?
That's a very important part of the book, and it's one of the last chapters by design, because first of all, I wanted it to be there at the end after everything else was discussed first, because it's so often the question that we understandably ask. The anguish of the situation of the contemporary aguna is so self-evident and so clear and apparent that the question is understandable. So if there were ways to deal with problems that seem much less serious, so why is it that there isn't a clear and more apparent way to deal with the aguna situation? So a big part of the goal here is to first explain the challenges that are sometimes there and to explain what mechanisms are available, what mechanisms aren't available, and to make that a little bit clearer. So that was why the other chapters come first. So hopefully by the time the reader gets to that chapter, there is a little bit more of a grounding in the details of the system. And just like when it comes to medical cures, so the diseases that get cured are not necessarily the most dangerous diseases, but the diseases that have the tools to cure them. It's not necessarily always a question of the severity. That's a part of it. It's not the whole package in terms of what leads to a cure earlier or more readily, but that's part of the discussion. But also, I do believe that the contemporary prenuptial agreements that are in use, primarily I'm involved with the one that is advocated by the Bezdin of America, and I do have a bias towards that one because I'm a student of the Rebbeim who authored it and advocated it, primarily by Mordechai Willig Shlita, was the co-author of that agreement together with Zam Nechemia Goldberg, and is advocated by Rosh and others. And they believe that this can go a very long way towards addressing the situation of the contemporary aguna and should be understood and appreciated towards that end. And there is even more advocacy, perhaps, than has had taken place until now, that perhaps can be done. And that's also something that I hope will come out, reading the book in its totality. And at the beginning of the book, it mentioned that I don't like the word loophole because it implies that there's some kind of a deficiency in the system that's being exploited. And I think the prenup, the RCA Vesden prenup and similar approaches are actually even the opposite of exploiting a loophole. What they are a way of allowing the intent of halacha to actually have teeth and to have enforceability in the contemporary world, where we are decentralized and we don't have one jurisdiction. And that's a big part of why there is this problem. And what this prenup does is it restores the functionality of the halakhic system as it was once upon a time, and that it creates enforceability where there hasn't been enforceability, and it really restores the intent of the halakhah in a way that I think is very much in keeping with both the letter and the spirit. So if anything, it's a reverse loophole. It's the opposite of a loophole. It's plugging up loopholes, and therefore it's not only effective, which I believe it can be very effective in very large percentage of the cases, but also is very much in keeping with the values of halakhah as well, and should be appreciated as such. And I hope that that's something that will also come out from the way it's presented here.
So could you just take us, Rabbi Feldman, through this issue? We were talking about a contemporary guna. What are we talking about? What does the prenuptial do? And is it still controversial? I don't remember doing a prenuptial when I got married, and maybe my kids will. I don't know if they did one. So just what are we talking about when we talk about the contemporary guna? What's the plug here in the loophole?
So in the contemporary reality, it is possible really for either spouse to hold up the process by refusing to grant a get when it's indicated, and also for the wife to refuse to receive a get. And if either spouse refuses to go along with the process when a marriage doesn't have a future, so then the process will be brought to a halt, and both parties will be prevented from moving on with their lives, to tremendous anguish on the part of everybody who surrounds them and everybody who's involved. And that's a terrible situation. And it can go on for a tremendous amount of time. And that's very painful. And what the prenup does is it has two components to it. One slightly more controversial than the other, does have some controversy to it, although I believe, and again, here I'm influenced by my Rebbeim, but I believe I'm on firm ground here, that there is a good answer to the questions that have been raised, and I tried to display that in the book. I hope to display it in the context of a objective treatment of the questions, but I believe there's a good answer to the questions. And the second part, which I think would do a lot to make it effective also, that shouldn't have any controversy associated with it. So I'll mention the more controversial part first, and that is that there's a monetary component, that as long as the situation is going on, that the couple is technically married but not living together, so the husband is continuing to have an obligation to support his wife. And the assumption is that you're not going to want to keep supporting somebody you're not interested in living with, so that should encourage a speedy resolution to the situation. And crucially, that's not a penalty. This is just the reality of continuing to be married. So the controversy is there are those who perceive it as a penalty and also assume that a penalty would constitute coercion, and that therefore this would create a coerced get, which the halakhah sees as invalid. And the response to that is that this is not perceived as a penalty. It is the logical conclusion and continuation of continuing to be married, and that it has precedent in halacha. The Mesivus describes something similar to this in his Sefer Torah Skitten. The Takana Shum of various cities in Europe seem to have something along these lines that's discussed in the Sefer Nachal Yeshiva. Whether it was meant to accomplish things in the same way or not is a topic of discussion, but this was something that does have some precedent in earlier versions. And as I was alluding to before, it's really the opposite of a loophole, that it's the same kind of logic as a ksuba and the existing structure of marriage. It's just that those institutions are very hard to enforce in the contemporary culture, where we don't have one jurisdiction, we don't have one bezdin, and therefore there are, so to speak, loopholes in those systems where one can not comply with those rules. So the prenup allows there to be enforceability and creates a joint jurisdiction so that it'll be clear that these obligations are there. So if anything, it just restores the intent of the Torah and the enforceability of the Halakhah. So therefore, that's why I call it a opposite of a loophole. And it just brings everything back into accordance with the spirit. And therefore, in addition to it being very effective, I believe, from my experience, but it's also something that fits very well into the formula that we've described. And the less controversial part, the part that really shouldn't be controversial at all, and that I think would go a tremendous distance in addressing almost all of the cases, is the agreement to arbitrate, that there's an agreement between the couple that should there be any question, that they will have a agreed upon venue. In the case of the RCA prenup, it's the RCA Besdin, the Besdin of America, but it could be any Besdin. But that itself would go a tremendous distance, because so often the issues that keep these things going, or at least the way it's presented, is a venue dispute, that each side believes that they're right. And as soon as my spouse recognizes that I'm right and comes to the only Besdin in the world that is going to handle this fairly, then they'll be over tomorrow. I'm not the one keeping it going. They're the one keeping it going by refusing to go to this one fair Besdin. So if you took that off the table and you decided in advance that this is going to be where it's going to be handled, that would solve almost all the cases. It would solve a tremendous number of the cases. So, and that Rav Moshe Feinstein already had a tshuva about, and that really shouldn't be controversial at all. So I hope that that gets much more of an attention and a objective evaluation, and hopefully that should make a big difference.
How does this differ from conditional divorce, a get al tanai? And we're hearing about this now during the horrific period of the war, where we've heard of cases where conditional gets, conditional bills of divorce, have been given by soldiers before they go into fighting, on the assumption that if they're whatever it is, if they're missing for a certain period of time or presumed dead but can't be proven dead, is this is a whole different issue? And is this covered in the book? Is this part of the same workaround?
No, it's completely different. No, that's not a workaround. It's completely different. In those situations, the husband is interested in helping out his wife Khalila be in that situation, so he's willing to give the get that it should be under those conditions, and that it shouldn't apply should it not be. Whether or not that's the recommendation nowadays, itself a whole discussion that's dependent on a lot of other factors, but it has a historical basis. But that wouldn't be effective here, because that has to first be put into place, and what the Tanai would be very hard to formulate and could always be changed later. So it would require the continuing consent of the husband, and that would itself be very challenging under these contentious situations. And how exactly would be formulated, what exactly would trigger the Tanai, would be very hard to formulate. So while there have been proposals for get al tanai to address these types of recalcitrant situations, which are very different in terms of their cause, not necessarily in terms of their effect, but different in terms of the cause, than situations of a husband who's missing. So that has had a much harder time being able to address those kind of situations, and it's a very different type of mechanism.
There's Rabbi Feldman, there's a concept that any rabbinic enactment has to mirror a Torah enactment. Is this what we mean, what you mean by we talk about the spirit part of it? Is that the mirroring of a rabbinic enactment towards a Torah enactment, a Torah prohibition or commandment?
It's probably a different idea, but it has a common root. If the idea is that they should all share the same system and they shouldn't be at odds with each other, so then there is that commonality to it, that we believe that we're not in conflict with ourselves and that we're all working towards the same system, and that Torah law and rabbinic law and the spirit of the law and the letter of the law are all pointing in the same direction, and therefore they should be compatible with each other and they should reflect the same values and the same inner workings.
Just in conclusion, what's next in this area? If there is something that the Rav is working on in this area or some other area of Halakhah, what's next on the plate here?
So a lot of projects at the same time. I'd probably like to go back to some of my earlier books have been about areas of Ben Adam L'Chavero, and some of the topics that connect to that. So they're actually out of print right now, so I'd like to go back to try to bring them back into print and maybe enhance those a little bit. A few other things that are relevant to that I'd like to try to finish up. And we'll see who gets finished first.
Okay. Again, thank you so much. We urge all our viewers and listeners to take a look at Letter and Spirit, Evasion, Avoidance, and Workarounds in the Halakhah system. And Rabbi Feldman, thank you so much again for your time. We appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure.
Thank you.